Hello everybody, my name is Spencer Walsh and welcome to today's episode of Hidden History. On the show, it's time to tell you about a dark stain on our history. Well, that's pretty much what most of the show is. But on today's episode, we take you back to Reconstruction era North Carolina. A new government had just put in place. It was an alliance between populists and Republicans, and it was mostly black. We'll tell you how the tragedy of the Wilmington Coup unfolded on today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Welcome to today's episode of Hidden History, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Spencer Walsh. Today, we will be using a little bit of source material today from The Atlantic, Adrian LaFrance and Van Newkirk writing this, and talking about this 1898 turn of the century incident that took place in Wilmington, North Carolina. It really was unprecedented for a lot of reasons. It was obviously this kind of waning period at this point of probably one of my personal favorite periods in American history, just because there was so much hope, so much promise, and it really kind of had obviously has a tragic ending, the Reconstruction of slavery point of history. Where just for a few moments there was aggressive control on the slaveholding powers in the South after the Civil War, just for 10, 20, I think it was like 20 years or something like that. That was the kind of a historically recognized period of Reconstruction, but it came to such a drastic and tragic end as slowly but surely white slaveholders began to claw back power all over the country. And before that happened, though, there were some pretty cool things that took place, but this was not one of them. It starts off, by the time the fire started, Alexander Manly, so let's just start a little bit with this guy here, Alexander Manly, he had vanished. That didn't stop the mob of 400 people who reached his newsroom from making good on their promise. The crowd, led by a former congressman, had given the editor-in-chief an ultimatum: destroy your newspaper and leave town forever, or we will wreck it for you. So this is a white mob pretty much threatening to destroy this prominently black newspaper, a black-owned newspaper. We'll tell you why they wanted to destroy it in a second, but the name of the newspaper, it was called the Daily Record. And the morning it was burned was November 10th, 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina. And the fire was the beginning of an assault that took place 7 blocks east of the Cape Fear River, about 10 miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean. By sundown, Manly's newspaper had been torched. As many as 60 people had been murdered, and the local government that was elected 2 days prior had been overthrown and replaced by members of the Ku Klux Klan. For all the violent moments in United States history, the mob's gruesome attack was unique. It was the only coup d'etat to ever take place on American soil, a complete and utter destruction of a duly elected local government that just didn't go the way the white slave power wanted it to go. What happened that day was nearly lost to history. For decades, the perpetrators were cast as heroes in American textbooks. The black victims were wrongly described as instigators in, carefully called race riots. That was the idea that, those blacks were, quote unquote, causing trouble once again. The time it took nearly a century for the truth of what had happened to begin to creep back into public awareness. Today, the old site of the Daily Record is a nondescript church parking lot, an ordinary-looking square of matted grass on a tree-lined street in historic Wilmington. The Wilmington Journal, a successor of sorts to the old Daily Record, stands at a white clapboard house across the street. But there's no evidence of what happened there in 1898. Conservatives in North Carolina don't often bring up the Wilmington Massacre. Even many of those North Carolinians who are now aware of it are still reluctant to talk about it. Those who do sometimes stumble over words like insurrection and riot, loaded terms, and imprecise ones. Not only was it a coup, the massacre was arguably the nadir of post-slavery racial politics. That's why it was so shocking when, on Monday, the GOP's executive director, Dallas Woodhouse, openly acknowledged the massacre on Twitter in response to the tweet from the North Carolina Democratic Party about the Voting Rights Act. Woodhouse criticized what he saw as hypocrisy. The events of November 10, 1898 were the result of a long-range campaign by the Democratic Party leaders to regain political control of Wilmington, he wrote, at the time the state's most populous city in North Carolina, in the name of white supremacy. So pretty much with this guy who a few years ago tried to literally reclaim the mantle of civil rights for Republicans just because of the fact that the Democrats were the racist party back then. Now the Republicans are saying here it is true, and it was a really tragic event, and he describes it, I guess, relatively accurately, but except for the fact that he's criticizing the Democrats of current day for being hypocrites. But the truth is here, this was completely hidden from white history. Woodhouse may have been more interested in gaining political points than actually probing a painful memory of North Carolinian history, but Woodhouse's version is actually much closer to the truth of what transpired than many other accounts. A capsule biography of Alfred Moore Waddell, the former member of Congress who led the massacre, from the website of the Cape Fear Historical Institute in Wilmington, exemplifies what some students were long taught. And this, to me, speaks to such a good reason why we talked about it a lot this season, especially in the panic of, concurrently, because, of course, I don't know if you listen to Newsflash, but I do follow the news. There is, of course, this big panic over critical race theory, and a lot of it is, I think, how we interpret America, how we interpret what we've done in the past, and what that carries into how that carries into our perspective today. And I think what a lot of conservative blowback is, they are used to, first of all, being taught narratives like the narrative I'm about to tell you about a time where, white supremacists literally overthrew majority black government and murdered a lot of the people in it. Not only did they do that, but then they continued to paint it off like it never happened. Like this kind of narrative is what many people have been taught for many years. Other people, mostly younger, are starting to realize and push the fact that, hey, this is not true. This is a lie, and there is really slow, really poor kind of slow acceptance to it. And of course, with that comes a whole lot of resistance. We're going to see that coming, I think, very, very soon, and continuously all throughout a lot of current politics. But this is how it was described by the Cape Fear Historical Institute. The Democrats and most white citizens of the state feared a return to the corrupt and financially devastating rule of Republicans as had been experienced during Reconstruction in the late 1860s. So, of course, very, very blatantly already here, a pro-democratic narrative. They were worried about the corrupt Republicans coming in, the dastardly Republicans, putting them under, military rule and martial law for a long time under the support of Grant because, they tried to overthrow the United States government in a civil war. Anyway, Waddell, I don't know why I'm trying to rebut old historical propaganda, but whatever. Waddell led white Wilmingtonians in their effort to shut down a racially inflammatory black newspaper. Just playing it off like shutting down and burning down a newspaper is just a normal thing. And then became the mayor of Wilmington after the unpopular Republican regime had resigned. He just became mayor of Wilmington. Incredible. What a cool guy. As mayor, Waddell quickly restored sobriety, peace, demonstrating his capacity to act with courage in critical times. He continued in this office until 1905, leading a responsible and honest government. That passage was written by Bernard Thursam, who is the former chair of both the Cape Fear Museum Board and the state chapter of League of the South. While Thursam's account diverges sharply from the documentary record, it is instructive in one regard. Thursam clearly identifies the 19th century Republicans as liberals or radicals. In his writing, often identifies the 19th century Democrats simply as the conservatives. So pretty much proving a lot of the narrative that, that guy, chairman of the Republican Party of North Carolina, Woodhouse, was so wrong about. The Republicans were the liberals and the Democrats were the conservatives back then. According to historian David S. Selsky, presenting Waddell as a righteous campaigner for peace and sobriety was standard in Wilmington until the 1990s. Literally, 1990s, 100 years of lies this town was told about the fact that, it is built off the murder and destruction of a duly elected black government. He said, I grew up in a small town in eastern North Carolina, 90 miles from Wilmington, Selsky says. I had a book in my middle school classroom that listed the 12 greatest North Carolinians ever. It included the Wright brothers, Virginia Dare, and then it included 3 of the people who were the leaders of this white supremacy campaign. For something like Wilmington in 1898, Selsky said, it's hard to describe the levels of indoctrination. In 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, they bragged about the coup. After that, they backed off, but it stayed in history books, and they talked about it as an unfortunate but necessary event. This is something they were proud of. This was really a big turning point, a big moment, a big milestone on the campaign by the losers. Oftentimes we hear, the winners write history. Oh, yeah. This time it was the losers writing their history in the South and making it really into a political narrative, a political force for nothing but the most evil ideas in our country and in our world. In fact, part of how historians have pieced together the real story of the Wilmington Massacre is by looking back at newspaper archives from towns all across North Carolina, not just Wilmington, where similar voices coordinated that day. Similar violence, was coordinated that day. They burned black newspapers down all over the state. They shut down entry to the city from blacks and Republicans. It's important not to forget that this was a planned thing. This wasn't 2 people getting to fight in a street corner and sparking underlying racial tension or something like that. This was a coordinated plan and growing thing. But state officials solidified their grip on power by promoting the very fiction. They originally called the 1898 incident the Wilmington Race Riot, with implications the event was instigated by a riot from blacks and quelled by Waddell's fighters. So those good citizens just came in to calm down the crazy blacks that were getting out of hand. Was the idea, was the perpetration put forth by so many people for literally 100 years. 100 years. After open celebration of white supremacists lost favor, a sort of bland sanitizing of the history dominated recollections. That lasted until the time of the centennial of the massacre in 1998, when scholars and descendants of the Wilmington black community that had been nearly destroyed in 1898 began to push for recognition of what really happened. A state's acknowledgement of the 70-year reign of white supremacy during the Solid South period followed the same pattern. Men like Charles B. Aycock, an agitator of Wilmington riots who 3 years later was elected governor on a platform of white supremacy, were revered in the state until recently, in some cases still are. Glenda Gilmore, a North Carolina native and professor of history at Yale, refers to the whitewash period as a 50-year black hole of information. According to Gilmore, the bloody history of white supremacy was largely unacknowledged in the state's educational system. Someone like me, I never heard the word lynching until I was 21. This history was totally hidden for white children, and that was deliberate. But now that history is being uncovered and spread, Aycock's legacy has been reconsidered, and the collection of buildings and landmarks named after him in the state has dwindled. The Wilmington Massacre is widely acknowledged as a coup and a foundational moment in creating a white supremacist state, and a big part of the cultural force and the political force that came to dominate the South. The systematic oppression and driving out of politics and of any kind of good economic circumstances of black people. And really, what takes place now is just kind of digging out from under that legacy, that huge lead that, again, the losers of history, the losers of the war, were able to write because of the fact that, Andrew Johnson got in there, screwed things up, and eventually, Reconstruction came to that. We could talk about that on another episode, but just to give you circle back maybe a little bit and talk about this Wilmington history, because it is important to remember and realize that this history has not only been hidden from white people, but also hidden from black people.
We were refused. We were rejected by the librarian.
When I asked about or inquired about 1898, they wanted to know why.
I was told that, yes, they had something, but they kept it under lock and key.
Yeah, I mean, it really shows you the incredible fact that this was, and a lot of times, aggressively taken out, sanitized, and whitewashed for many, many people. I mean, if this was going on in Wilmington, you better bet that a lot of other people in the town were not going to hear of it. or in the country for that matter. Like, if people in Wilmington couldn't hear it, is my point, then, people in the country, worldwide, nationwide, would not be any wiser. An important thing to remember about Wilmington was at the time it was a perfect model of what so many white people across the South feared as a new rising, a new culture. Like, Wilmington was a majority black city. Tons of black people were, just because the boot being lifted off their necks a little bit, and some sort of, and really a lot of rights given to them that they haven't had in the past. Black people were starting to get elected to office, holding a lot of jobs in high positions, making money, building a thriving middle class, and great new fun, not necessarily fun, but I guess prosperous environment. Like, the thing that people like in the KKK, for example, feared the most, the thing that would really devalue all their worldview that just spent so many years pushing on the American people, and definitely actually believed themselves, is that black people are inferior just because of the shape of their skulls. We have to keep them down. We can't give them equal rights because they're just not smart enough. That had been completely turned around, and fear upon all fears, black Republicans were getting elected regularly to office during this kind of 1880s on through the 1898 massacre in this Reconstruction period. Like, this was happening on a regular basis. And the key thing is here, this is really one of my favorite parts of American history, is and we talked about it a little bit in our end of our last season. You can go back and listen to our P-word series, talking about the word populism and the political impacts it's had. Well, this was a big political impact right here in the South. Populism really reaching some of its highest points, and they were a third party that kind of ran in this political alignment, this political alliance called Fusion Party. The Fusion Party with black Republicans and white populists, poor farmers, bringing together and starting to realize that they were a lot closer to each other economically than the big plantation owners who had been trying to drive racism as a means of allying themselves with the large majority of white farmers who had been much more inclined previously to the point to go more towards the plantation owners. Now they felt themselves a lot more alive with this fusion type of politics. Of course, there was still plenty of people voting for the white racist Democrats, but I believe it was called the Bourbon Democrats back then. But this was all kind of changing. Like, there were black and white governments, people in the state house representing them, that were of all different types of races, not all different, just the two, really. Diverse coalition for the first time, fusion, populist, allying with Republicans and sharing the state between black and white, all on lines of economic solidarity around the fact that, hey, we're in the same boat together, and we can defeat the Democrats, who not only are incredibly racist, but use their racism to divide the general working class, proletarian, I guess to use a Marxist term, population. So that was really coming together, and a lot of strength was being grown on that. The state was pretty much dominated by either this kind of populist Republican alliance for much of the elections of the 1890s, leading up to, of course, the 98 massacre. And reforms were really, truly being put in place that made both black, farmers, black workers, everyday black people better, make their lives better, and also making poor whites better, lifting them up at the same time and creating that very, very dangerous coalition between poor black people, poor white people. And when they start to realize that the thing that they have, that their real true common enemy, the thing that's holding them back in this life is not, the advancement of black people into the marketplace, quote unquote. It's the fact that the marketplace is being screwed up in awful ways by the leaders of the Democratic Party, then, well, the Democratic Party is kind of screwed. This Vox video called The Missing Chapter explains why they were so pissed off about the big wins of these fusions between the Republican and the populist.
Go next slide.
A multiracial government wasn't just a disappointment for Democrats. It was more like a humiliation. They needed a plan to take back control of the state in the next election. So party leaders like Furnifold Simmons, future U.S. Senator, Charles Aycock, future North Carolina governor,
Talked about him.
and this man, Alfred Moore Waddell,
Talked
came
about
up
him
with
too.
one. To beat the Fusion Party by luring white populist voters away from their alliance with black voters. Wilmington, with a large black population and a local fusion government in power, would be a focus of their campaign.
So this is what was going on here. It's an incredibly important kind of political dynamic, and I think fascinating political dynamic to pick up on. This real alliance and this time and time again effort, I think probably most successfully done, although it wasn't really entirely, I would say, successful with the populace, was aligning with, black workers in the cities with white farmers nationwide. And they did this so successfully in Wilmington. And the fact that this idea of not, economic solidarity, not proletarian solidarity, but white solidarity was what had been the kind of status quo, what was put in place up until the Reconstruction period, all throughout the Civil War. Things change a little bit, but then the key electoral strategy that you saw them do here is say, hey, just flip the script that the Republicans are trying to push. The biggest threat to you is black people advancing in society, taking your jobs, getting, and of course, all the implications that come with that, occupying your position in life. And I'm sure there was some, psychosexual, racial stuff going on there as well. Like they're going to come into your homes, they're going to rape and abuse you and your daughter and your wife and stuff like that. All this kind of horrific campaigning that is further explained in this video.
The state Democratic Party handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it."
Yeah, so that is a strategy that has been used from then on. It was used before that, and I would argue it's still being used today to divide what I think should be a unified working class. So one of the biggest things that they used to do this campaign of alienation, this division campaign of breaking up this incredible fusion coalition of Republicans and populists, even though the fact that the fusion government was mostly right, was this stoking this fear through the media. And the News Observer was a big newspaper at the time that was pretty much a Democratic Party mouthpiece. And they talk about how they used all this propaganda, this manipulation through cartoons.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule, even though the fusion government was mostly white. They also played up another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme. White men need to do all that they can to protect white womanhood.
This was all part of North Carolina Democratic strategy, but it echoed the national racist rhetoric of the time. In one speech that Democrats printed in a Wilmington paper, a prominent Georgia writer named Rebecca Felton said,
"If it takes lynching a black man a day to protect white womanhood, I say lynch."
Her speech prompted a Wilmington black man named Alex Manley, owner of the black-run Daily Record newspaper, to respond with a column. He made a simple observation.
Yes, remember that. I'm gonna take your record scratch, bring it all the way back to the beginning of this episode where we talked about this guy Manley, who ran the Daily Record newspaper. That was one of the biggest inciting incidents that freaked people out so much. A lot of the stuff, it wasn't entirely economic, it wasn't entirely material. It was just playing off some of the deep, deep fears and kind of feelings, these deep, deep feelings that have been entrenched in the South since slaves first came over and were working on the fields. These deep kind of sexual, racial feelings of priority, of status, and of position over somebody, and the fact that black people were always viewed as simultaneously these kind of beastly beings, these kind of people who had no brains, were like stupid, were low, were animal-like, were closer to apes and all that stuff, but also viewed as these kind of conniving, dangerous people who you couldn't turn their backs on. They were always trying to steal. They were always trying to take from you, and they were so cunning about it. And also, one of the things that many, many people feared was, again, this idea of white womanhood being put in place right along with this kind of economic feeling, and this feeling that Negroes were going to be controlling your whole lives in a material sense. Also, as we see today, used by the right, this kind of cultural sense, that deep feeling that, black people were, almost more of a threat. They were going to come, they were going to threaten people, threaten the idea of this kind of charming, Southern belle, just out there doing just whatever, and she gets attacked. But this was the big threat. This response by Manly is kind of a, crazy thing to write. If I'm being honest, this guy Alexander Manly writing this was that a lot of the times it wasn't the black men who were going after the white women. It was vice versa. That idea was really what pissed a lot of people off. And this drew a thick black line through the white and black parts of the Fusion Coalition. So here it was, the Democratic Party could now say, this crazy black brute, as they literally called him, Alexander Manly, is insinuating that not only are black guys going to come around and take all our women, but our women are going to love it. Like that, you can picture all the awful things that were written in these newspapers and shouted all around town leading up to this big election that was taking place in Wilmington at the time. People were freaking out, tensions were high, and they saw the Democrats did. They saw Wilmington, this majority black population where a fusion government was already in power, as the chance, the one opportunity that they had to really make a show. So the election finally rolls around, and Vox describes how it went.
By all accounts, the elections of 1898 were a sham. The Democratic Party had a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts. They attacked and blocked black residents from voting. At a rally just before the election, Alfred Moore Waddell provoked the crowds. He said, "Negro office holding ought at once and forever be brought to an end, even if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses." The votes were counted, and the Democrats won.
Democratic candidates won every seat they had a candidate up for election in.
But some local fusionist politicians remained in power because their seats hadn't been up for re-election, like the white Republican mayor and the Board of Aldermen. And of course, the election did nothing to undo the economic power black folks held in the city. The Democrats had won the election, but their goal of total white supremacist control remained out of reach.
So yeah, this was just violence all the way throughout. So during the campaign, white police rode into black homes, whipping black men and threatening them with death for attempting to vote. On election day, armed white mobs gathered outside Wilmington polling places, threatening any blacks who cast a ballot. And of course, the result, the Democrats won every elected position in which they ran, as you just heard. Once equipped with political power, Democrats turned to their second goal, which is, again, eliminating economic wealth of Wilmington's black citizens and instituting a state of white supremacy. The day after the sham election, Wilmington Democrats published the White Declaration of Independence, which stated, quote, "We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin." The declaration stripped Wilmington's black citizens the right to vote, demanding the city jobs held by black men be given to white constituents, and that Alex Manly leave town or be lynched. And of course, luckily, he escaped to the north. The following morning, hundreds of armed men marched on Manly's printing press and the offices of the Daily Record, burning both to the ground. The mob marched to the city hall, where they forced the rightfully elected Republican mayor and city alderman to resign. Waddell was installed as the city's mayor replacement. After the coup, the mob swelled to nearly 2,000 men, who then terrorized the city. Backed by the newly instated racist police force and state militia, and armed with guns and a military-grade Colt machine gun capable of firing 420 .23 caliber bullets in a minute, the mob killed at least 60 black residents, though historians say the number could well be into the hundreds. Pleas for assistance from the black Wilmington citizens made to the state government and the White House went ignored. And this was, again, 1898 when this was going on. So not exactly a great time in American history for racial politics. But in addition to the killings, the mob forced virtually all of Wilmington's black and upper middle class citizens, black middle and upper class citizens, to flee town, sucking out all the wealth, all the prosperity that may have happened, very similar to what happened in Tulsa. Once gone, the newly elected local government began instituting Jim Crow segregationist policies as local law. The coup decimated black political and economic power in Wilmington for nearly 100 years. By 1902, the number of registered black voters dwindled down from 125,000 to about 6,100. After the coup, no black citizen served in public office until 1972. It wasn't until 1992 that a black citizen was elected to Congress. The black and middle merchant class has never been reinstated to this day, says David Zucchino, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the book Wilmington's Lie. The coup left a permanent scar on the city. Wilmington became a place where no black people would go unless, to borrow a phrase in the newspaper, they knew the place. To borrow a phrase used in this newspaper, the News and Observer, they, quote, knew their place. Immediately following the coup, for more than 100 years after, North Carolina's newspapers, media, and state-run institutions obscured or distorted the truth, as we talked about in the first half of this episode, describing the one-sided coup as a race war instigated in part by black aggression. Many of the coup's leaders, including Waddell, Daniels, and Aycock, were heralded as brave heroes, and no one was ever arrested or prosecuted for any of the Wilmington coup's crimes. And this is, again, another one of the things that we have to come to terms with. And I say this, I feel like I say this like kind of at the end of every episode of just like, this is a part of American history. We got to understand this, guys. But yeah, like it is, I am going to be here. I think it's my personal job, even though, a lot of other people are going to do it besides me, to say it, come out, say it over and over again, that this stuff happened. This is a part of our country's history, just with all the rest. We, literally destroyed an entire town. We systematically cut off, time and time again, nationwide, not just in Wilmington, but all across the country, cut off by any means necessary, opportunities for black people to advance, and did so through violence, did so through economic sabotage, did so through bullying and harassment in other ways. It was and is all encompassing, all threatening, and really never really rested, and was such a negative force. And it's so important and so critical that we examine this distortion and really get the truth out there, because the truth is really what this show is all about. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Hidden History. Join us tomorrow for a new episode of Newsflash, and maybe we'll be able to squeeze in another episode of Uncultured, getting you ready for more NBA Finals.